Hello and welcome to your Chapter 12 lecture series where we're going to talk about nervous tissue. And we'll start off by discussing section 12.1, which is an introduction to the nervous system. Our nervous system really helps us communicate and control our body. And so some of the main functions are going to be to collect information, and we could do this through our receptors, for instance, within our skin, but of course we have them all throughout our body. And they're going to detect different types of stimuli and send those sensory signals to our spinal cord and our brain. So you can see both of those over here. And another function would be to process and evaluate that information. So here's another photo that depicts that sensation that we're carrying in. We gather that from our receptors, pull it in through a sensory or afferent neuron to our central nervous system. So that would include our spinal cord, which we see here. This is a cross section of the spinal cord. And then we can either quickly send that over to another neuron, or this information will travel along the spinal cord and head up toward the brain so that we can also determine what we're going to, or how we're going to respond to that sensory information we put in. And then we would initiate that response. So maybe if we processed it within the brain, that information would go down the spinal cord and then exit out the proper level through an efferent or motor neuron over to our effector, which is going to be a muscle of some sort, cardiac, skeletal, or smooth, or a gland. So let's talk about some structural organization. We already mentioned that our central nervous system is made up of our brain and spinal cord, and then everything else pretty much falls into our peripheral nervous system. And everything else consists of these nerves and then these little ball-like structures called ganglia. And ganglia are little collections of cell bodies within our peripheral nervous system. So we'll talk more about that later. Now for our functional organization, we're going to look at sensory function versus motor function. So first, let's take a look at our sensory nervous system. It is working to detect stimuli and transmit that information from our receptors to our central nervous system. And we could break it down into our somatic sensory system, which is going to detect stimuli we consciously perceive. For example, that would be any of our five senses. For example, the eye, in which we would have those photoreceptors in here to give us the sensory information of light, and our proprioceptors, which let us know kind of where we are in space. And the other system we have is a visceral sensory system. So remember, anytime we see that word viscera or visceral, we should think organs. And this is helping to detect stimuli we typically don't perceive. So this would be the signals from our heart, or maybe some signals from our kidneys. It can even be from our blood vessels. Now let's think about our motor nervous system. This is also known as our efferent nervous system. And to differentiate efferent and afferent, we can think of the word same. So SA would refer to sensory and afferent, meaning the same. And ME would refer to motor and efferent, meaning the same thing. So we see that over here. Just something to keep in mind. Now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about what our motor nervous system is all about. We're going to initiate and then transmit that information from our central nervous system and then out through our motor or efferent neurons to our effectors. And so depending on which system we are in, we'll have different effectors. So if we discuss our somatic motor system, we're sending voluntary signals to our skeletal muscles only. Whereas if it is within our autonomic motor system, we can also call this our visceral motor system, we're sending involuntary commands to things like the heart, which is cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, that would we would find within our hollow organs and glands, and they would have sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So something like the heart would be innervated by both of these divisions. And the last thing we'll cover in this section is basically the anatomy of a nerve. A nerve is going to be a bundle of parallel axons within our peripheral nervous system. And of course, we have to organize this with our connective tissue wrappings. So if we look at the nerve itself, the most external connective tissue that we're going to have is called an epineurium. So we're enclosing that entire nerve, and it's a very thick layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. Beyond that, we organize our axons within fascicles, and so surrounding each of these fascicles is a perineurium, and this is going to be a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. And if we are to look at just one of these axons, and it may have those myelin sheaths covering it, which we'll talk about extensively in the coming sections. So surrounding that axon and the myelin sheath or neurolemma site here in the peripheral nervous system is going to be the endoneurium. And so this is just going to be a delicate layer of areolar connective tissue and will separate and electrically insulate each of the axons. Now you can also see in here that we have a vein and an artery. So our nerves are vascularized so that we can branch through the epineurium and epineurium to become very small capillaries to supply these nerves and allow for exchange between the axons and the blood. And if we look at our structural classification of these nerves, we can classify them as cranial nerves, meaning they're extending off of the brain, and we're going to have 12 pairs of these, or they are spinal nerves, which we see pictured here, and they are extending off of the spinal cord, and we're going to have 31 pairs of these. We can functionally classify our nerves by setting them as either sensory, motor, or mixed. So if you look at this cross-section of the spinal cord here and these nerves extending out from the spinal cord, we'll talk about each of these functional classifications. So in blue, we are going to have our sensory nerve, and these contain sensory neurons sending signals to the CNS. So really this information is moving into the spinal cord here. Our motor nerves are going to contain motor neurons, which are sending signals from our central nervous system out. And then you could see at this area out here, this is actually called a mixed spinal nerve. And both of the neurons here are existing within one nerve. So that's why we call this mixed nerves. And even though this is a mixed nerve, the individual axons are transmitting only one type of information. So this blue neuron here is only going to transmit sensory information, whereas this red one is only going to transmit motor information. And then of course we mentioned the ganglion at the beginning of this section lecture, and this is a cluster of neuron cell bodies within the peripheral nervous system. And you could even see this in our previous figure here, figure 12.2, where the ganglion is present over here, and we could see each of those little cell bodies located in this region.